On the 27th of June 1970, Freddie Mercury walked on stage for the first time as the frontman of Queen. The venue was Truro City Hall in Cornwall, a modest civic building in a small city at the far southwestern tip of England, not a place that appears regularly in the history of rock music. The crowd was small, the sound system was whatever the venue provided, which was not much. Nobody in that room had any reason to believe that what they were watching was the beginning of something. Brian May was there, playing guitar. He was 22 years old. He has been talking about that night for more than 50 years. Not because it was an extraordinary concert, it was not. Because of what he saw in Freddie Mercury in those first minutes on stage, and because of what those first minutes turned out to be the first minutes of. On the 9th of August, 1986, 16 years and 43 days after Truro City Hall, Freddie Mercury walked on stage at Knebworth Park in front of 120,000 people and said good night and sweet dreams and walked off a stage for the last time. Everything that happened between those two dates, every concert, every record, every moment that made Queen what they became, began in Truro in June 1970. Brian May was at both ends of it. He has never stopped thinking about either. The band that became Queen did not begin as Queen. It began as Smile, a trio formed in 1968 by Brian May and Roger Taylor, with a singer named Tim Staffell, who had been a friend and bandmate of Brian May's at Imperial College London. Smile played the London circuit, recorded a single for Mercury Records in America, and developed the specific kind of following that good London bands developed in the late 1960s, a real following, a genuine response. The beginning of something that had the possibility of becoming more. Freddie Mercury knew Smile. He knew Brian May and Roger Taylor and Tim Staffell from the same intersecting worlds of London Music and Art College that connected everyone in the late 1960s British rock scene. He went to their gigs. He talked to them after the shows about the music, about what they were doing and what it could become, about the gap between what Smile was and what Freddie Mercury thought a band could be. Brian May has described Freddie in this period as someone who could see the potential in what they were doing more clearly than they could themselves. Someone who was watching from the outside with the complete certainty of a person who already knew what they wanted to do and was waiting for the right moment to do it. In the spring of 1970, Tim Staffell decided to leave Smile. His reasons were musical. He wanted to pursue R&B and soul rather than the heavy rock territory Brian May and Roger Taylor were moving toward. He left without acrimony. The band he left behind was a band without a singer. Freddie Mercury had been waiting for exactly this. He had been in other bands, Ibex, Wreckage, and others, performing, developing, finding what he was. But those bands had not been the right vehicle. Smile without Tim Staffell might be. Brian May has described the conversations of that spring as the conversations in which everything changed, in which Freddie Mercury's vision for what the band could be was articulated to people who had to decide whether to trust it. Roger Taylor was persuaded. The name was changed, Freddie's suggestion, Queen, which Brian May and Roger Taylor initially found uncomfortably provocative, and which Freddie thought was exactly right. On the 27th of June, 1970, they played their first concert in Truro City Hall. Tim Staffell left. Freddie Mercury was waiting. He had a name, Queen. Brian May and Roger Taylor thought it was too much. Freddie thought it was exactly right. They played their first concert in a small hall in Truro. Brian May has said that within the first few minutes of watching Freddie Mercury on stage for the first time, he understood that something had changed, that the band he had been in before was not the band he was now in. 22 years old. A small hall in Cornwall, the first minutes of everything. Truro City Hall in 1970 was a functional civic space in a small Cornish city, the kind of venue that touring bands use for events too small for anything grander but needing a proper hall. A few hundred people at most. The stage was modest. The sound was whatever the promoter brought. This was the very bottom of the touring circuit, where the room contributes nothing and the music has to do everything. The audience had come to see a band they likely did not know well. What they were about to see was a person who would be, 16 years later, the greatest rock performer of his generation. But there was nothing in the room in June 1970 that told them this. There was only what Freddie Mercury was able to make visible in the time he had. Brian May's accounts of watching Freddie Mercury perform for the first time have a consistent quality, someone describing something that exceeded what they had been prepared for. He had known Freddie as a person, understood his vision, his ambition, his certainty about what Queen should be. But knowing what someone intends and watching them do it are different experiences. What he saw was not simply confidence or stage presence, though it was both. It was something more specific, an immediate and complete relationship with the audience, not built gradually across the set, present from the first moment. The quality of someone for whom the space between performer and audience does not exist as a space at all. Brian May was playing guitar behind him. He has said he kept looking up from his playing to watch what was happening at the front of the stage. He could not stop looking. The specific quality that Freddie Mercury brought to those first Queen concerts, the quality that Brian May saw from the first night in Truro, was not something that could be learned or developed in the ordinary sense. It could be refined, and over 16 years it was refined to an extraordinary degree. But its essence was present from the beginning. He understood the relationship between a performer and an audience as a physical and mutual thing, not a performance given by one party and received by the other, but a transaction in both directions. A specific electricity generated by the contact between what he was doing and what the crowd was giving back. He moved differently on stage from anyone else. He held the microphone stand in a way that was entirely his own, the broken stand in the early years, held not as a prop but as an extension of the performance, repositioned and used and occasionally hurled with a completeness of physical investment that suggested the whole body was involved in the singing rather than just the voice. And the voice, already extraordinary in those early years, already capable of the specific quality of carrying an entire room with it, of making everyone present feel that the music was addressing them specifically and no one else. He was 23 years old in a small hall in Cornwall. He had never been the front man of a serious band before. He had no recording contract, no manager who believed in him completely, no history of large concert audiences, no evidence beyond his own certainty that what he was attempting was possible. And he walked on stage and did it as if the evidence existed, as if the history existed, as if the certainty was not something he was performing, but something he simply was. Brian May watched from behind his guitar and could not stop watching. That is the beginning of the whole story. The years between Truro City Hall in 1970 and the first real breakthrough, the EMI, signing in 1973, the first album, the first chart positions, were the unglamorous years of becoming. Queen toured the UK circuit relentlessly. Universities, polytechnics, ballrooms. John Deacon joined on bass in February 1971, completing the lineup that would remain unchanged for the next 2 decades. The set grew. The specific Queen sound, layered vocals, orchestral guitar, theatrical ambition was being discovered in venues considerably less impressive than the music it was attempting. Brian May has described these early years as formative in the sense that the gap between what they were and what they were trying to be was the space in which they became what they eventually became. At the front of every show, Freddie Mercury was doing what he had done in Truro, making the audience feel the music was larger than the room. The distance between the first Queen concert in Truro City Hall in June 1970 and the point at which Queen became a genuinely global phenomenon is measurable in years roughly 5, from 1970 to 1975 in Bohemian Rhapsody, but the distance in scale is almost impossible to describe. Truro City Hall held a few hundred people. The concert at Earl's Court in 1977 held 17,000. The tours of America in the late 1970s sold out arenas. The 1980 Game Tour sold out Madison Square Garden. The 1981 concert in Buenos Aires drew 300,000 people. The Magic Tour of 1986 was the most successful Queen tour ever. Stadiums across Europe, sold-out dates in multiple countries, the largest shows Queen had ever played. At every step of this progression, the person at the front of the stage was doing the same thing he had done in Truro in 1970, making the audience feel the music was larger than the room. The rooms had grown. The principle had not. The 9th of August, 1986 at Knebworth Park was the last concert Queen ever played with Freddie Mercury, 120,000 people, the largest paying audience Queen had ever performed for in England. Freddie Mercury arrived by helicopter. He wore the yellow leather jacket. He performed with the full commitment of someone who understood, as Brian May believed he did, that the time for performance was limited, that the specific window in which he was capable of this was closing. He said goodnight in sweet dreams in the crown and the gown at the end of the final encore. He walked off the stage. Brian May was there. He had been at Truro too, had watched the first minutes of it in a small hall in Cornwall 16 years earlier. He has stood on stages with the Knebworth footage playing on the screen behind him and played the music alongside the recording and has said across all the years that it never becomes routine. The distance between Truro and Knebworth is the whole of what Queen was. Brian May was at both ends of it. Truro City Hall, June 1970, a few hundred people. Freddie Mercury, 23 years old, walking on stage for the first time as Queen's frontman. Knebworth Park, August 1986. 120,000 people. The same man, 16 years later, walking off a stage for the last time. Brian May was at both. He was playing guitar at both. He has never stopped thinking about either. Everything Queen ever did is in the distance between those two nights. What Brian May saw in Truro in June 1970 was not what a 22-year-old guitarist sees when he watches a new singer perform for the first time. He has tried to name it across 50 years of interview stage presence, connection, the quality of someone completely at home in a performance space from the first moment. But there is something in his accounts that goes beyond descriptive language and arrives at something simpler. He was astonished. He had not known what Freddie Mercury was capable of in front of an audience until he saw it. And what he saw astonished him, quietly, consistently, for the rest of his life. First astonishments, when they are genuine, do not diminish with repetition. Brian May watched Freddie Mercury perform hundreds of times after Truro. He was astonished every time. If you are encountering Queen for the first time, the story of Truro City Hall in June 1970 is the beginning of the explanation of everything you have heard. The voice, the presence, the quality of someone who could hold 70,000 people in Wembley or 300,000 in Buenos Aires. It was not produced by fame. It was not success creating confidence. It was there in a small hall in Cornwall in 1970 when there was nothing to be confident about except Freddie Mercury's own certainty. Brian May said the Truro show was when he understood what Queen was going to be. He did not know how right he was. The beginning was Truro. Everything else was built on top of what Brian May first saw in that room. Small hall, June 1970. Nobody knew. Freddie Mercury walked on stage for the first time. Brian May watched and could not stop watching. 16 years later, 120,000 people at Knebworth, the yellow jacket, good night and sweet dreams, and the last time. Everything in between, every song, every show, every crowd of thousands or hundreds of thousands was built on what happened first in that small hall in Cornwall. Brian May was there. He has never stopped talking about it. Now you know why. On the 27th of June, 1970, Freddie Mercury walked on stage in Truro, Cornwall, and Brian May watched him from behind his guitar and could not stop watching. On the 9th of August, 1986, Freddie Mercury walked off a stage at Knebworth Park, and Brian May watched him go and did not yet know it was the last time. Between those two dates, 16 years, hundreds of concerts, millions of records, one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of rock music, and the specific quality of one person's relationship with a live audience that no one who was in the same room with it has ever adequately described, because it was, in the end, not something that description can hold. You had to be in the room. Brian May was in the room in 1970 and in 1986, and in every room in between. He carried what he saw from the first room into every room that came after, and he still carries it. Every stage he stands on now, with the red special and the silver hair, and the footage of Freddie Mercury playing behind him on the screen, every one of those stages is Truro. Every single one. It was always Truro. It started there. It never stopped starting there.